with us. And it is my absolute privilege to kind of introduce our speaker for today. And I don't know, we'll kind of do like just a real quick kind of inception of how this all got started. This kind of was a dream project, if you will. We thought about some of the questions that you all have been putting in your chat or the evaluation section at the end. And it was really questions beyond our scope as like leaders of the grant. This was more kind of medical based questions that, sometimes we do get as educators, but we're really not qualified to answer. So I guess when I say dream scope, this was, we all have friends that are, medical professionals. And if you're like me, sometimes you'll text them and you'll say, I got this question and I'm not really sure how to answer. So I went to the CEO of Rockcastle Hospital and I just said, hey, this is what I'd like to do. This is kind of my dream project, if you will. We have this wonderful group of educators that are continuing to learn and to grow, but we continuously get these questions asked of us. And it would be really great if we had medical professionals that kind of worked alongside with us and kind of helped us tackle some of these questions that we get as educators, that we can say, hey, we do feel a little more equipped to kind of go back and kind of, embrace or kind of tackle those questions. So dream project is now kind of coming to fruition. And that brings us to today's guest speaker. And our title of this series, if you will, is RX for Learning, or Prescription for Learning, because you all know when you go to the doctor, sometimes we get prescriptions and those prescriptions make us better. And our goal for these series are to make us better educators. So today we have with us Miss Courtney Browning. And Courtney comes to us with a wonderful resume. She's been working in pediatrics for 22 years. The last 12, she has been a pediatric nurse practitioner at Rockcastle Peds. And I will speak near and dear because that is the place where my children have both grown up and received care. They are fantastic. And I know we have some Rockcastle teachers on here that can speak to the same quality of care. She previously worked as an RN at the Kentucky Children's Hospital, and she taught family health nursing at EKU. Again, it is my great pleasure to have Miss Courtney here with us, and she's going to talk about the impact of technology on the developing brain. And we're going to talk about both the positive and the negative effects and how that impacts learning and academic performance. So, Miss Courtney, thank you so much for being with us. I know we've got 75 on. There may be some more that join us, but this is a topic that we get a lot and that we face a lot in the classroom. So thanks for being with us. I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'll be honest, we talk about this in the clinic all the time, and we make little off the cuff comments all the time about how kids are changing. And when I say we, I probably mean more me and Callie than the other providers, because we are a little bit older than the others. We have seen, I think, things change a little bit more than maybe some of the younger providers, but we make a lot of comments about how kids are changing, how parents are changing, how the landscape of parenting and school and everything is changing because of how rapidly technology has changed. Side note, I've been down here in Rockcastle for almost 13 years now. I live in Richmond. I ended up down here because I used to work with Dr. Callie. I was a brand new nurse in the Children's Hospital when she was doing her residency. And so we used to work night shifts together. And when I went back to school, I came down here. So we do sometimes go, gosh, remember back when they weren't doing this, or they didn't have this, or they didn't have access to that. And so we make comments all the time about how technology and screens, and you're going to hear me interchange words quite a bit today, how they're impacting what we do in here. And so I know they're impacting what you all do as significantly, if not more, than what we do in here. What was interesting to me is when I started trying to look at the actual evidence, the actual research, like what do we know about what technology, like not just what we say in here when we're like, everybody has ADHD now and nobody does this, or what is the actual research? It's limited. Like technology changed so fast and so rapidly that one of the things I found when I was doing my research is a lot of people saying, this is what we need to research, this is what we need to figure out, these are the questions that have been raised. Um, but there's not a whole lot of hard evidence because now everybody's looking back and going, oh my gosh, how did we get here so quickly, and what have we allowed to take place? So I'm gonna click through some of this with you all and hope we have time at the end to kind of all just chat. And some of this may be a little sciencey, so if I go too sciencey on you, let me know. And I'll try to clarify things for you. One thing, I threw a few terms on here just at the beginning before I get going, because I did find when I was looking at these research articles, everybody wants to call stuff something different. And so one article would refer to their digital experience, and one would refer to their screen time, and one would refer to, and they would have all different things. My favorite term, I guess, when I started reading through all these articles was the digital experience, because it's a little more all-encompassing. And they defined it just as interacting with or engaging with digital devices. And I didn't really think about it until this next slide that lists all of the digital devices that we interact with throughout the day. We think of the phone, we think of kids with the phone in their face, and we talk about it in here. Every room I walk into, they're trying to keep a kid entertained with a phone or a tablet. We think of those all the time. But when you get into how brain structure is literally actually changing because of this stuff, the research says it's not just the phone, it's not just the tablet, it's all the things. It's the laptops, it's the Chromebooks, it's even their VR devices they have at home and their Apple Watches that the teenagers are wearing, and all of it together impacts the technology that one person uses in a given day. And we can't not use technology. We know that. That's the world we live in. We have to use it. So it's how do we learn to use it smartly, I guess. And so I kind of said, why do we care? One thing that we're figuring out is that all of these digital devices play a pretty significant role in children's early learning and development. And I'm getting ready to talk about that early period. And I don't know, I wasn't really sure what age everybody's working with. A whole lot of this research is focused on the younger kids. I'm going to bring up adolescents a little bit. And that's just because we're getting ready to talk about neuroplasticity, but there's a whole lot more going on with what changes in the brain in those first 12 years than there is after. So when we're talking about technology, is it positive? Is it negative? Is it both? Is it age dependent? Is it dose dependent? Does it depend on how long they spend on there and what they're looking at? And then we're going to talk about active and passive screen time, because that's the one thing there is plenty of research on. The one thing that came up in every research article I read was the knowledge gap, that all of this is developing, still developing. Something new comes out every day. My kids are 14 and 17. They're way ahead of me with stuff, and they're like, look at this, or I used that, and I'm like, what are you even talking about? I can't keep up. And so as parents, as medical providers, the researchers, people making policy, the educators, it's really difficult to keep up and to know like how to make an informed decision. I will say, after researching this for you all, I told Hannah, our office manager, we probably need to have a provider meeting and talk about how we better incorporate some of this into our well checks, because I have a lot more concerns than I did before. Before I was like, I mean, Dr. Callie would be like, maybe, and now I'm like, oh yeah, we need to catch these kids before they even get to you all, because the damage is taking place early, and that's what's kind of scary. And now I'm gonna have to monitor all this research too. So this gets into some of the kind of science talk, and you let me know if I get ahead of you or you want me to tell you something a little more in detail. But when we're talking about how this technology is affecting these kids, what these articles and research right now being done is looking at is neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is the ability of all the networks in your brain and a human's brain to change due to growth, experience, and environmental factors. And this takes me back to one of my very first peds nursing classes when we talked about nature versus nurture. But that's what it is how do all these experiences, some of it is genetic or destined with what we're born with, but a whole lot of it is their environment and how it impacts how their brain develops. And when I get into some of the changes we're seeing, there's two different ways that technology is affecting children's brains at this point. Functional plasticity is the brain's ability to alter and adapt to the actual properties of each neuron in your brain and what that actual neuron is capable of. Structural plasticity is that the brain is malleable and it can be changed in how all those neurons circuit and network together. So they can experience changes in the gray matter. The gray matter is what we consider more functional. It's the actual neurons, it's the actual brain itself. The white matter, when I mention it later on, is how all those are connecting to each other, how the different pathways in the brain are forming connections. So you may hear me say things about gray matter and white matter, and that's what I'm talking about later on, is how their use of technology is literally structurally changing their brains. Like it's interesting when I got in here and saw, and like we said, early childhood is your main period of developing your cognitive, your relational, your social, emotional development. And technology is beginning to play a major role in how these kids do that compared to how they used to do that. I also mentioned executive function. These are things that you all may already use these terms. I don't know what terms are used in education. And so some things I kind of defined a little just to make sure. But these are just a set of processes that support goal-oriented behavior, adaptive responses to new situations. And a lot of these, when they're studying technology, they study a child's executive function, like how they're able to respond to the things they're taught. And we'll talk about that. And you all know this. Age 0 to 12 years is considered the most sensitive period of high neural plasticity, meaning when the brain is still malleable, when we can still change things, and their biggest period or growth of executive function. They're still doing it in adolescence. But unfortunately, some of these articles kind of are like, it's a little late by then if what we've already done is done. So we'll talk a little bit, though, about how it's impacting the adolescents, too. One thing that I thought was interesting, I'm going to throw a couple of pictures up here that hopefully you all can see, is these articles or these research studies I was looking at, like what areas of that brain does the digital experience influence? Because a lot of them will mention just language or memory or attention, or it'll look at just the connectivity in here. And when I show you these next couple of pictures that I hope you can kind of see at least, it's the whole brain. Like technology isn't impacting just one area. It's impacting it all. So this specific picture was looking at brain functions. So this means actual structural changes in the brain. Like they did MRIs on kids before and after certain use of technology and could see actual structural changes on the MRI based on the amount of technology they had used. So it's not just us sitting around here saying, oh, it may be impacting them or they may be using it too much. It really does change. And one of the things is it changes good and bad. And so what I feel like there is not enough research on, and we'll talk about that at the end, is how do we weed out the good from the bad? How do we decide which things are making these good changes versus which are making the negative ones? So on this particular picture, everything that's in red or that darker red was a positive impact that they found from a good form of technology. Everything that's in that darker blue or light blue was a negative impact. So it caused some kind of less gray matter or something like that. And then there was just a couple studies that I think there's just two little areas of purple that are hard to see on there where they found a mixed, like it had some good and some bad. And I think it'll come up later. That was almost always video games. Video games was the one thing that seemed like it could be both good and bad. And some of it even depended on what type of video game it was. So that was kind of interesting. This one is on, I think I labeled one of those incorrectly. This is the one that looked at how the connectivity, like how the neurons connect with each other after the digital experience. This was more like on EEGs and other form of neuroimaging. So everything in blue there was a negative and everything in purple was a mixed. There were a couple where they found no impact, but there were not any that found a positive effect on connectivity, meaning how those neurons and different pathways interact with each other. So that's a little scary. The other thing to be aware of when you're looking at what technology you're using, whether it's in the classroom or whether parents are using it at home, the one thing they found was it's not just the direct effect. So all of us think about how does staring at this screen or looking at this thing affect their brain? And so that's their actual interaction with that specific media, whether it's social media, whether it's a learning app, whatever it is, how does that directly affect them? But one of the things that a few studies looked at and that a whole lot more studies need to be done on are the indirect effects. So is it just the technology or is it what the technology is replacing? And so some of them looked at how the technology impacts the family and community dynamic. So is it the actual technology that is the problem, or is it the lack of parental interaction because they're all just on the screen? Is it the lack of interaction in a classroom or wherever they are because we're replacing ways that we used to learn with technology now? And so a lot of these studies had to kind of look at, was it just the actual technology that caused the problem, or was it the lack of other things that led to the changes in learning or the changes in the brain? And when I was reading this, all I could think about was like every kid I see in here is just touching a screen. They're just clicking and they're watching and they're touching a screen. And I think back to my kids who had the books and they were rubbing the fuzzy bunny or lifting up the flap to look for something or feeling the scaly skin on the lizard or whatever it was. And that was what I was thinking of when I'm reading this is we are allowing so much technology to replace the other forms of learning that we had even early on. And what's scary, and I'll have to get you all's input on this too, is that so much of this takes place before they ever enter a classroom. So much of what I'm getting ready to talk about takes place before they ever make it to you all. And so that's why I said we need to have a provider meeting because this falls on us when they're coming in here in these early well checks to try to intervene to help you all later on. I literally have one slide, I hate to say this, on the benefits of technology, because in all of my research, everybody just wants to talk about what's bad about it. And we know there are some good things. We know there are ways we use technology that are great and are super helpful. But there's a whole lot of ways that it's not. And so, some of the things they found that are great, and you all I'm sure are very familiar with these, I am because my kids use them, are the adaptive learning platforms. And so things that the kid changes, that identifies their needs, that advances as they advance. these do enhance learning outcomes, and we like these things. Certain digital platforms do help stimulate curiosity, get kids' attention, promote critical thinking skills. If you're using the right thing, there are things available that do this, and they are beneficial. Community building, socialization, collaboration, exposing kids to diversity. Some of these articles talked about kids from one country being able to work on a project with kids from another country because we have the technology to do that now, and that is a beneficial way of learning. Being able to connect to things that they couldn't connect to without the technology, that's a benefit. There was some evidence of benefits for neural exercise, cognitive training, and improved memory. What was interesting, and it'll come up on a slide later on, in younger kids, most of the ways they are using technology were shown to impair memory. But there are a lot of new technologies out for elderly that help improve memory. So it's interesting. I think what you're going to find when they do more research is that it's the type of program. It's what you're actually using. And they are developing a lot to work with people with dementia and Alzheimer's and things, and they are helpful. The one I find super intriguing is the video games. And there's a lot more research on the video games for some reason. I don't really understand that, but they have been shown to improve visual attention processing, spatial visualization, reaction time, and mental rotation. Basically teaching you how to respond to things more effectively, how to respond quickly. There was some stuff with hand-eye coordination, and I have a few, this doesn't apply to what you all are doing, but I think it was the best research I could find that shows there are true benefits. So they looked at a group of surgeons who played video games, and they were specific video games that were shown to improve this visual attention, the reaction time, the mental rotation, like being able to get through ideas quickly and decide what to do. So in this study, the surgeons who played these video games more than 3 hours per week, and I will never admit any of this to my husband. I will tell you all, I will never admit any of this to my husband. The surgeons who played these video games for more than 3 hours per week made 37% fewer surgical errors, were 27% faster in their response times during a surgery, and scored 42% better in measures of laparoscopic surgery and suturing skills than the surgeons who did not play the video games. And I was like, that's really interesting. So they did another study to expand this. And they look at some specific action-based video games and found that these surgeons in that group who were experienced players of these video games made 47% fewer errors and performed 39% faster in the OR. So I put that in here just because so much of this research is negative. It's like all technology is bad. It's all rotting their brains. But it's not. Like, they found that this was a way of actually improving their skills and their response time. I think what we need a lot more research on is which programs are actually able to give us these benefits, versus some of the kind of mindless scrolling that's causing all the negative type situations. But there are definitely positives to using technology. And I just thought that was pretty interesting. Getting into some of the negatives, and I don't think anybody who has worked in a classroom recently will be shocked that attention comes up first. But almost every study addressed how the use of technology and the amount of screen time in these children's lives is affecting their attention span. And I mean, we say in the clinic now, we got, especially me and Dr. Callie, because we are older, we got trained on how to fix physical issues, but probably 50% or more of what we see in a day is now a mental health, and a whole lot of that is attention deficit and hyperactivity disorders. And we just see a whole lot more of it than we used to. So how is technology affecting that? One of the things, and I definitely sense this in my life all the time, is attentional overload, which is there is so much technology available to us. We can't possibly focus on all the things that are being put in front of us at any given time. And so these articles looked at things like you have alerts, you have notifications, you have social media updates coming to your phone, you're getting emails, you're getting calendar reminders, texts, news feeds, whatever it is. Um, there is so much technology available that sometimes it's just an attentional overload. There's no way you could possibly divide your attention amongst all the things being in front of you at the same time. And they're actually doing research. Obviously, I know a little more about the medical side, in distracted doctoring, where like, is that affecting our practice in the clinic during the day when we are getting all these things sent to us from all these different ways? Are we able to focus when we're in the room with a patient because of all the other notifications and things that we're getting? The other way it looked at it was continuous partial attention. So we have so much available to us now. You know, when I was a kid, the example I was giving in here, talking to one of my students one day, was when we wanted to learn about the birds and the bees. There was this book in the library at my middle school that had all the pictures and all the information, and that book was always checked out, and everybody was in line to get it because this was the only way, I'm aging myself, that we could find out all these things if our parents had not already told us. And now kids have unlimited access to all the information all the time, and that's kind of a scary thing sometimes. And they get access to things earlier than we want them to have it, and maybe when they're not ready for it. But also they get access to too much at one time. And so this continuous partial attention is when you're trying to divide your attention up between a whole bunch of things all at one time. And that's creating some problems. These things, the attentional overload and the partial attention, are more common in your adolescence in the classroom. And one of the big things it talked about was like if they have access to their cell phone, they're paying more attention to that than whatever is going on in the classroom. If they have an Apple Watch on, they're getting all those notifications the whole time, and that's distracting them from listening to what's happening in the classroom. And so they just don't retain information the same way because they're not paying attention to it. And that, I think, is on the next slide. But over and over and over in all these research studies, higher levels of screen time in general, any form of screen time, are associated with an increased likelihood of ADHD symptoms. And that includes all screen time: television, video gaming, computer use, smartphone scrolling. One of the biggest issues is the scrolling, because these kids, from the time they're itty bitty, are trained to have constant stimulation and rapid shifts in attention. If they don't like what's on YouTube Kids, they just keep clicking that button until they find something they do. And if they only like that for 45 seconds, great, because they can just keep clicking and pick something new. And it's literally training them from the time they're little to not be able to hold their attention on a specific task or a specific topic or whatever it is. But what I found interesting is, in my mind, I was like, well, we're just training ourselves. If we take, we're just training ourselves to scroll TikTok or click through YouTube. And so we're teaching ourselves to not focus. But in part of these studies that use the neuroimaging, in these children where they did MRIs before and MRIs later, these children actually had reduced gray matter in the areas of their brain related to cognition and emotional regulation. And so all this scrolling, all this screen time, all these things when they're little actually causes their brain to not develop as many neurons. Like, they literally don't have as much capacity. The other thing it looked at was if they don't have downtime from the screens for their brain to rest from that, it results in impaired executive functioning. They don't retain information as well. They don't control their emotions as well. They don't respond as well without that brain rest. Like your brain needs time away from the screen. And I think about it when we have a kid like with a concussion from sports or something. There's been a whole lot of research on the fact that they have to step away from the screen for their brain to repair itself after a concussion. One of the things we teach them is don't be looking at your phone, don't be looking at the TV. For your brain to heal, you got to step away from the screen. These research studies are showing for your brain to learn, you have to step away from the screen. You need some downtime. You need some brain rest. So I thought that was pretty interesting, but I would say all of us are aware that the screens are probably a big contributor to the increase in attention deficit currently in our kids and teens. To go along with that, there are some studies showing that it's affecting our memory and how we remember what we are taught as well. And they referred to this as digital dementia, a decline in your cognitive ability caused by excessive use of digital technology. And over all the different studies I looked at, they showed actual memory loss, attention deficit, reduced ability to communicate, impaired decision making. One thing I thought was really interesting, because I had just said this to my student a couple weeks before I started researching, was it says that when we rely on digital devices to store our information, we are less likely to remember it long term. So if we know somewhere in our consciousness that this is something we can just look up again on Google later, our brain almost intentionally doesn't store it. And I had told my student this when she was new. I said, you know, I've been doing this a while. And when I trained with this nurse practitioner. If any of you all had kids here and remember Mr. Tony, he was awesome. But he was probably like 65 at the time. And he made me, when I was working with him, carry this little notebook. And he kept his in the pocket of his scrubs. But he made me carry this little notebook. And anytime I was learning a new way to dose a medicine or learning something about a different type of rash that was unusual or whatever, he had my little notebook divided into sections, and I had to open that section and write it down. And I would look at Mr. Tony and say, you know, there's an app for this now, right? And he would say, I do know that. I want you to write it down. And he would make me write it in my little notebook. And I was telling my student, I said, all of those things that I learned then, I still remember. I said, newer medications that are out, I have this program called Up to Date that we use to keep us up to date on all the latest things. I said, I look up, and I don't remember what medicine I was looking up with her that day. I said, I have looked this up probably 20 times, and I still look it up every time. But all those ones I wrote down when Mr. Tony told me to, I remember. And I said, maybe this should just teach me what kind of learner I am, and I need to start writing things down. But part of these research studies said it is actually a new phenomenon where our brain just intentionally doesn't store information because it knows it can find it here later. That because we know we can Google it, because we know there's a calculator access, because whatever, our brains are not even trying to store information at this point, which is a huge impact on the classroom. Like, depending on how we teach things, that can be a major thing. There was some studies that talked about how we've used GPS so much that it is causing a decline in the general public's hippocampal dependent spatial memory, meaning we don't even understand how we got places sometimes. Like we couldn't look back and repeat it. We can't remember how we got there and which turns and different things because we just relied on the GPS and didn't bother to store it and know what we were doing. Other things it talked about were just the large amounts of information available. Makes it difficult to process and retain information. It makes it difficult for kids and adults alike to pick through what is good versus bad. What should I look at? What should I remember? And then the constant distractions of all the notifications. I don't think this would be shocking. There were several studies that showed Students who access phones or social media during class had lower levels of recall of what they were taught in class. And that's just because they're not paying attention. But this one also showed, when they were doing the studies with the neuroimaging, lower gray matter density in the areas of the brain involved in memory and emotional regulation. And that's just coming from the screen time. It's just affecting how their brains actually structurally develop. And that study showed that the children with increased screen time who had the lower gray matter density had poor test scores and poor fast recall related to those changes in their brain compared to the children that had not had as much screen time. Sleep. This one was really interesting to me, and so I have been trying to unplug a little better than I did before. It was shown in infants and toddlers that infants and toddlers using touch screens, it negatively impacts their sleep onset at night. They're going to sleep later. It affects how long they're able to stay asleep at night, and it increased their nighttime awakenings. And this was dose dependent. The more screen time they had during the day, the worse they slept. In children and adolescents, same thing, sleep problems leading to daytime sleepiness. And we all know if they're tired in the classroom, they're not going to learn, they're not paying attention. But what they're finding is this one does depend, when I put up that list of all the different types of digital things, this one is dependent on the blue light. So watching a TV did not have as much effect on sleep as looking at a phone or a tablet. And this is because the blue light that is emitted from a digital screen, there are now multiple studies that show it actually suppresses your melatonin production and disrupts your sleep-wake cycle. It changes your circadian rhythm. So scrolling your phone or your iPad or whatever digital screen device in bed actually does not only make it more difficult for you to fall asleep, it prevents you from getting into the right types of REM sleep to make memories. So this was really interesting. There was a study on adolescents, and it said the adolescents who scrolled their phone prior to bed were shown to retain less of the information they had learned at school that day, because if their brains don't get into the right level of REM sleep at night, they don't store that information the same. Your brain doesn't store it and lock it away for recall later if you don't get into the right levels of deep sleep. And I thought that was super interesting. I'm like, it makes me want to put my phone away a little bit at night now and be like, I need to make sure I'm sleeping better. And we know this about other things. There have been studies that show if you are super anxious, you don't form memories as well. And they've related that back to not getting into the right levels of sleep. But there were two studies that both of them showed, especially in teenagers, since they have a little more access typically to their phones at night, that if they had scrolled that phone too much before bed and it affected their sleep cycle, they did not retain what they learned at school that day. And it was because they did not get into a deep enough sleep to store the memories correctly. So even if they did manage to keep their phone put up during the day and listen during class, if they were scrolling before bed and didn't sleep well, they still didn't retain the information. So critical thinking and learning. And before I mention a lot of this, I do want to say, we'll circle back to the end of that not all digital technology is created equal. So it's not all the things out there that are leading to these negative outcomes. But there definitely needs to be more research on which ones are good and which ones are bad. And most of the research I looked at was not good at separating the active and passive screen time that I'm going to talk about at the end. It was just looking at their total screen time. And what these studies, I think, really need to do is try to figure out how to separate the good from the bad so that we know which things are still good to be using with these kids. But they said in general, those students who had more time on social media had lower GPAs. There was not a direct and I will say that about several of these studies, they had problems showing cause and effect. They could show the correlation. We see this happen, but they couldn't say always specifically why. Is it just because they're distracted and not paying attention? Is it because they were scrolling TikTok instead of doing their homework? Like, what led to the lower GPA? They were not always specific about. Studies showed students who were using multiple devices at one time had lower comprehension scores. I think that takes you back to the memory when it talks about the multitasking and being distracted. So if they're trying to be on their Chromebook and do their homework, but they're also glancing over here at all the notifications on their phone the whole time, the multiple device comes into the lower comprehension because they're digitally distracted, I think was in one of the articles, by all the things coming at them at once. There were several studies showing children who use digital tools for more than 2 hours per day had lower tests on cognitive scores than those who use less than 2 hours. There were several that looked at not just increased screen time, but the fact that the screen time was reducing their actual reading time. And that was associated with poor language development and executive functioning. The children who had the screen time seemed to be replacing their time actually reading or being read to had decreased brain connectivity between the regions of the brain that control word recognition and then language and cognitive control. And this was on some of that neuroimaging when I talked about the white matter and how all those neurons connect together. Is that increased screen time actually caused them to not make those connections between seeing the word and then understanding the language. And it talked about this affecting their reading comprehension abilities. That decreased connectivity in those areas made it drastically lowered their reading comprehension scores. And that's kind of in that next little bullet. Increased screen time was linked to decreased integrity of those white matter pathways necessary for reading and language. One specific study that I felt like you all would find interesting looked at preschoolers, and they tried teaching them in reading and language in 3 different ways. They had one where they listened to audio only, and some of that was recorded and some of that was like a teacher just talking or whatever. They had children who were taught using illustrated picture books. So these were preschoolers. And so the teacher or parent was reading it to them, and then they had still images. So just think of like a picture book. So they're teaching them or reading them and showing just actual pictures with it. And then they had students that watched animated videos. So it talked, but it was like more active animation. And they monitored them before, and then they had this type of learning for 6 weeks, and then they checked everything again at the end. The children who were read to by a parent or a teacher with these still illustrations, their MRIs showed the best connectivity in their white matter. So these kids had the best scores after 6 weeks, were the ones who had the still pictures and someone reading to them. The children who had only audio or only those animated videos, which a lot of us would think might be better than still pictures, actually had lower scores and lower connectivity. It also affected their attention span in both of those groups and their ability. They did not pay attention based on the observers in the study. They did not pay attention to the audio or the video as well as they did to like a real human reading to them and using the pictures. There was another study that looked at this similar thing after that study came out that said children could learn effectively with screen-based learning, but it was only effective when there was an engaged caregiver or educator participating in it with them. And so whatever app or learning program, if they did it by themselves, it did not improve those connectivity pathways. But when they did it with a parent who was participating in it with them, or a teacher who was participating with the class as they did it, then it did improve their connectivity. And so when we get into some of the positives and negatives, that comes up frequently, is that it's not that the technology is all bad, it's was somebody engaged in it with them. Is it replacing that interaction? And we just kind of want to make sure it doesn't replace that interaction. There was another one, and oops, I noticed this with my teenagers. Children and adolescents exposed to social media that had misleading information. Those who had increased screen time showed a decreased ability to critically evaluate that information and determine, is this real or is this fake? And I feel like my kids, we've always had a lot of limits on screen time because of what I do, and I've tried to control it and whatever, but I will never forget my 17-year-old now when she was like 14, 15. I said something about her not having gone to the bathroom while we were somewhere all day. And she's like, oh, well, I try not to. I try to only pee twice a day. And I'm like, why? And she's like, because there's this girl I follow with all her health advice on TikTok, and she says if you can train your bladder to only pee twice a day, you're healthier. And I was like, I'm gonna fall out and die right here because I'm like, do you know what I do for a living? And you're taking advice from some college student on TikTok who is telling you you should only pee twice a day? Like, this is really horrible, and you're gonna end up with a UTI and get really sick. I'm like, why are you listening to people on TikTok? But there was several studies that said that part of these things that have happened to them on screens when they're younger are impacting their critical thinking and decision making. And so now what they see on screens when they're older, they don't have the ability to tell like what is real, what is fake, what is someone you should listen to versus someone you shouldn't listen to. And that's kind of scary. Little side note on this, and I had trouble finding information, and I'm going to keep working on it because it really intrigues me. All of the studies that showed that screen time was negative towards their learning abilities, it was all related to language and reading, word recognition, all of it was that. It was never negative. It never negatively affected their scores in math. And so I think that's interesting in a way. As educators, it does seem like technology can be used to effectively teach math concepts, but maybe we don't need to be using it for the language and reading as much. Because most of the negative effects, and some of these articles even said, it did not have an impact on their ability to reach their math skills. Their math scores were still great. It was all of the reading and language and comprehension and those sorts of things. So, and I think any of you all who work with kids have probably seen this. There are negative impacts on their social and emotional intelligence. Increased screen time in some studies was shown in these children and even adolescents that the more time they spent online, the less they were able to recognize facial emotions when shown images of people. That if they spent all their time on the screen, they had difficulty recognizing happy versus angry versus sad when they were shown images. And adolescents with increased screen time have less ability to recognize nonverbal emotional and social cues. I definitely see that in my kids and their friends. And we talk about it a lot at my house. I mean, I've looked at groups of teenagers that just all sit on their phone because they literally don't know how to talk to each other in person. They only know how to do it online. Like they've lost the ability to, or kids that don't know how to order at a restaurant or different things because everything they do is online. And I don't talk about this a lot because I feel like it's something we may deal with more than you all do. But I'm sure you see it. There is a huge increased risk of anxiety and depression related to bullying, comparison to others, social isolation. Like we see this all day, every day. And this is, they're keyboard warriors. They're able to hide behind the screen and pick on each other or what. I could go on all day about the things I see in here related to anxiety and depression over the stuff they do on the internet. But that's a little more related to social things than it is how is the technology actually changing your brain, which is what I tried to focus on. Okay. So this is the thing I've kind of mentioned over and over. And so as I get to the end of all this and say, how does this help you? The biggest thing all these articles referenced was active versus passive. So passive is these kids mindlessly watching videos or shows, scrolling on autopilot, clicking over and over and over on whatever video, versus something interactive where they're actually playing a game or solving a problem. Some kind of app that is teaching them something. Communication, like one of the things it said was actual video chatting where it was live does not affect those social emotional things as much as just watching videos of people. So if that person is interacting with them, it's different. Content creation, making digital art or music or coding or things like that. All of that is active. Most of these studies, it's the passive screen time. Some of it is the total screen time, but the passive screen time, and then I think I mentioned this before, the guidance, they need the guidance with what they're doing. It's more effective if someone is physically helping them with it. This I'll make quick because I know we're nearing the end of our time. These are AAP guidelines for parents as to how much screen time is recommended. They just revised these last year. AAP being American Academy of Pediatrics. That is who dictates everything we do in our jobs. I don't know how familiar you all are with it, but they dictate everything we do. Their current recommendation is under 18 months, they really should not have any screen time other than video chatting with real humans because that is such a crucial time in brain development. Like they really don't need to be having touchscreen use. They don't need to be watching mindless videos or from 18 to 24 months, high quality programming and hopefully a parent or someone else is involved in it with them. Age 2 to 5, they want you to limit to 1 hour per day of high quality programming. Once again, not scrolling YouTube Kids and clicking everything you see. And then older children and adolescents, set screen limits, have identified rules, be an active parent who is supervising what they're doing, and also model this for them. Show them good use of your phone, good use of time on the internet, good use of time on social media, that kind of thing. Their recommendation for educators, and I did find a little bit from the AAP, was that you prioritize the active versus the passive. Like things that are simulation, collaboration, they're making something, they're designing, they're doing critical thinking. But they said because we want to limit overall screen time in the course of a day, don't have them doing passive things that could be done some other way. Filling out digital worksheets, consuming information without any kind of reflection or teacher involvement, stuff that does not involve imagination or participation. Don't have them do it on the screen, have them do it another way to limit their total screen time in the course of a day was their recommendation. I don't know how many of you all have seen this website, and I can send it to Wendy if anybody wants it. This is who the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended for all educators, and it has a curriculum developed that is age and grade based. I think it starts at kindergarten and goes all the way through 12th grade on how educators can help their students in the classroom know how to best use screens and digital technology. And it was pretty interesting to me. I kind of went through it a little and looked at it, and it has a full curriculum with everything a educator would need to use in the classroom. And it's broken down into which topics are appropriate for which ages. And it, even if you don't use it, it's helpful for you to see what you could be teaching them at that age and how you could be helping them become responsible for their own use of technology. And it talks about, they have sections on media balance, on privacy and security, on what digital footprint that you leave, on bullying, digital drama, hate speech, how to interpret what you see in the news and media. So it was pretty interesting, and I can send that out if anybody wants it. And then the other thing the AAP says, just to keep in mind, are the 5 C's. Child being, make sure it is specific to their need. And so like adaptive learning programs and things do that. Content, is it age appropriate, and is it based on evidence? And that's one of the things they really talked about, is how limited the evidence is on which learning apps are actually helping them learn and develop critical thinking skills versus which are not. And it said most things that you can just get on the App Store are probably not really, have not been screened and determined appropriate. Technology should never be used to soothe or calm. And this is one I think we need to be working on with parents. Like, that's not a good use of it, and that's not a good use of screen time. Technology should not crowd out other forms of learning. Kids still need hands-on learning. They still need to learn things in other ways. They still definitely need to be read to, which is what we kind of talk to in a lot. I talk to people about in well checks in here a lot. Technology is great if it's augmenting what they're learning, but if it's crowding out and taking the place of other forms of learning, then we need to try to limit it. And then communication, just setting clear expectations of how long they should be using things, whether it's at home or in the classroom, teaching them how to regulate their use of it so that they're not, like, they're literally addicted to it. These kids can't put it down. And I watch them scream and throw fits in here when their parent takes the phone away just long enough for me to do an exam. Like, they physically have a meltdown because they can't handle life without that screen. And so teaching them self-regulation is really important. My little takeaways were, we have to use it. We live in a digital world. We have to prepare these kids for what is out there. They're going to have to be able to use all the different forms of technology, and they're going to need it in their jobs. And it does have positives. It can develop certain critical thinking skills. They did, there was a lot of research. It's helped in math, and some of these learning programs are great. It just needs to be monitored and limited. And it doesn't need to be the only way that we interact with our kids. This is a part for us to work on in the clinic when we're working with these moms and their young well chicks. And then a lot of this could not determine cause and effect. It was all just a correlation. And so looking at which types of technology are causing this and which aren't is a major thing that we need to start looking into. And that is all I have. But it took my whole hour. Does anybody have questions, though, or anything I didn't address that I might be able to answer?
You've got lots of love in the chat. There were
Oh,
lots of people saying,
let me
how amazing that they agree that this has been fantastic. But there were a couple of chats, or a
Sure.
couple of chats. There were a couple of questions. If I can't scroll back and find your question, please feel like,
Yeah.
I know Jennifer Cooper said, what about using Chromebooks during school? Because I know a lot of schools have transitioned to Chromebooks. What do you think about that? Or
I think it depends on how they're used, and we were talking about this in here the other day, because my kids go to school in Madison County and they don't do that, so I'm not super familiar with it. But all the girls that work here are like, oh, my kids are on it all day. I think what I take away from this is, if they're using it for a reason that it helps, that it is some kind of adaptive learning, it is some kind of program that we know, if it's just to be on the Chromebook instead of doing it with pen and paper or some other form, it's probably not the best use of technology, especially since so many of these studies say that that total screen time in a day is what's affecting how that brain matter actually develops. If it's something that could be done just as easily on something other than a Chromebook, or maybe even better sometimes, I mean, especially because so many of those studies said it's the overall total in a day cumulative that's the problem, but also what level of interaction. And one thing I kept thinking about is you all have no way to control how much screen time they're getting at home too. So like you don't know what their total screen time is once they've left you. They may have hours and hours where their parent lets them just be on the tablet or the video game or the phone. And so if we can limit some of that screen time when they're away from their parents is probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Because I kind of thought about that as I was reading through all this, is like, we can educate and educate and educate, because I try to do it in here all the time, but they don't always listen, or it's not always the easiest way, or
Yeah. Like you said, we have no control
yeah,
over
we have
that.
no control what happens when they're not with us. Um,
Um, oh, I apologize. Another question, and this is kind of for our adult learners or even some of our students,
mhm.
I guess, but if you listen to music, podcast, audiobooks, etc., on your phone, does that have the same effect on the brain in a negative way, or is it different because it's audio?
Um, Nothing overly addressed that. And that was one thing I noticed. At least not in the research with kids, which is what I looked at mostly. Other than they don't develop the same language and comprehension, but that's younger. So like when you're older, I don't think it has that same, I think it gets into those 5 C's too. Like look at the specific child. Um, and I do think one thing I noticed was not mentioned in any of these studies is that different people have different learning styles.
You eating anything?
Um, and I know this with my oldest daughter. I remember she was really struggling with a certain subject in 5th grade, and she was having trouble when she read it to retain it. And her teacher actually suggested, and this is before you have access like you do now, because she's older. He's like, see if you can find someone reading that to you on YouTube and see if you absorb it better when you listen to it. And that worked for her. And for years, she listened to everything because she learned it better from listening. So one of the things that bothered me in all these studies is I felt like they didn't take into account the individual. I mean, it's an overall, like, we saw this happen, but I do think there are some people that is a better method of learning for them. But most of this, even though it said it was looking at the full digital experience, most of the research is looking at the actual screen time. So that was one of the areas I had marked and things I wanted to keep looking to see if people come out with new stuff.
Yeah, perfect. That's a great point. Another question, and this is, I think, what we're all kind of wondering at this point. So I love this question that came up was, you've given us great positives, negatives, but can we do anything to like reverse? Like if, because we all went through COVID, we all went through that experience and we know that we were all probably I mean, I know myself, my kids, all of that, probably way too much screen time. Is there anything that we can do to kind of reverse this?
So I am still looking at that. I think the problem with most of the research is it's so new. They're still trying to figure that out. Like they just figured out, oh my gosh, it's causing this problem. Now let's figure out what we do. And I think that's because of COVID. I think that's when everyone realized, oh, we need to look at what this is doing. The only area I found where someone had looked at that, and I think it's because it's going to take longer to research what happens like structurally. But there were a couple of studies that did show when they decreased screen time, especially in younger kids, but I think there was one in adolescents too, when they decreased their overall screen time, their social emotional did improve. They did see significant improvements in emotional regulation, especially, and better being able to calm themselves down and better being able to control some of those meltdowns and outbursts and other things that we see, because that stuff does just overstimulate their brain and mess up some of those pathways. So there were some studies that did show improvements in that when you decreased the screen time. There was improvement in their emotional regulation, in their social recognition. So those areas, yes. I didn't find any that looked at improvements in the actual structural integrity. And I think it's because those studies that I found were all so new. They're all post-COVID, that they've just now realized it's a problem. So now they're going to have to research, can we fix it by changing things? But there were some that were able to be done a little faster that showed improvements in the social and emotional regulation when you decrease their screen time.
All
I'd
right.
like to add
Oh, go
something.
ahead. Yeah, I was going to say, anybody else have a question?
I'd like to add, you know me, Wendy. I would like to add something to what Courtney said earlier about the meltdowns when we take the screens from the kids. True story. I had a parent meeting last week, and the kid, it's a bit disruptive, to say the least. But it got to the point where I had to ask the parent to put her phone down so she could speak with us. I wanted to crawl over the table on that person. But I mean, had to ask the parent, can you, can you please put your phone down? This is kind of important. We're having a meeting here about your child and your child's behavior. You really need to listen to us. I wanted to choke her.
Well, and that's why it talks about, I think, in some of these affecting the parent-child interaction. Like, is the problem actually the screen, or is it the lack of parent-child interaction, or is it what the parent is modeling for the kid? Because we see that in here. I'll have my nurse come in and be like, I don't even know why they're here because mom didn't get off her phone the whole time I was trying to room the kid. And she's like,
I was
I
going
have
to ask
no
you,
idea.
I was going to ask you, do you see a lot of that as well?
All the time. And the other issue that I see with it is it has become and I hate to be rude and hateful, but you all do this too. It's just a
Go ahead.
babysitter. Like, these parents don't want to parent, and so they're just shoving a screen in their face. And it's like I talked to I had a 4-year-old in here one day, and the mom wanted the kid diagnosed with ADHD at 4 because he was having these meltdowns. And I said, well, give me an example. And she's like, we were at the Mexican restaurant the other night, and he was playing on the phone the whole time they'd been at the table until dinner came. And then she tried to take the phone away. And so then he had a meltdown. And I said, well, what did you do when he had the meltdown? How did you handle this? I said, she's like, well, he was laying in the floor screaming and crying and kicking. And so I gave it back so he would stop because it was embarrassing. And I said, well, what you have done now is reinforce that behavior. So because he threw a fit, and then you gave him what he wanted, now he knows if I throw a fit, she'll give the phone back or she'll do whatever. She was like,
bad behavior.
well, what should I have done? And I said, I'll tell you what I did, and my kids still remember it. I said, when this happened with me and my husband, one of us took him out to the car and the other asked for the check in a to-go box. And after this happened a few times, they learned not to have a meltdown in a public place over a phone, because they weren't going to get it back and they were going to be made to leave, and they were going to eat their dinner cold at home by the time we made out with it. And I said, that taught them you can't act this way. And I mean, she literally just sat there going like, and so many of these studies, when they're saying, is it actually the screen or is it what it's replacing? And what I see in here all the time is like, they're not getting the interactions at home that they need. They're not getting discipline. They're not. So part of it is the screen is making their little brains so excited. It is hard for them to focus and pay attention and do. But I think a whole lot of it is they're also just not ever being taught to focus or
I,
pay
I,
attention.
I
Or,
actually asked my principal if it would be legal for me to hit her. He said, not on school property. I mean, I was so frustrated.
it's like, I'm sure some of you know Megan, the other nurse practitioner here. Her and I joke all the time. The issue we see, and you all deal with this all day, every day, is they would come in here and they want us to wave our magic wand and make it better right now. And it's like, we can't replace 5 years of parenting with a magic wand or a pill. Like, we just, it doesn't happen. So the biggest thing that I see is the challenge for us and for you all is, one, the biggest thing I saw in all these studies is so much of this damage is being done before they ever get to you all. Like, this is occurring when they're so little. And how do we address limiting that early screen time, like before age 5, so that they develop better behaviors? Because if they had developed better behaviors before they get to the classroom, then that screen time is not as big a deal. They've learned how to self-regulate. They've learned emotional regulation. They've learned how to live life without these things. But then I also see, like, I lived life without these things. We didn't have cell phones when I was a kid. They didn't exist. I think I was in college before, I was almost out of college before I had a cell phone. Like, I didn't have any kind of tablet. I didn't have, like, I've still ended up addicted to it at times. Like, I still have to set limits on myself and walk away from it. So I don't know. It's such a, and we can't give it up. That's the other issue. You can't totally get rid of it because we've all got to learn how to use it. It's a necessary thing.
Right.
So it's like, how do we learn what to use and when, and how to limit it? And that's where the challenge is.
Well, I think you've given us lots to think about as educators. I know it was lots of great information.
Maybe a
I
little
know,
too much, but
no, it was wonderful. I mean,
can
I
be
think by
nerdy
the
about this
comments,
stuff.
you can see by the comments, everyone has loved it. And that's exactly what we wanted. We wanted these sessions to really make us think as educators. I know there were several comments in the chat where people said, that they were going to really think about their practices, what we can do as educators to really change our practices or to tweak our practices. And I think that's exactly what you've given us. And not just maybe students in our classroom, but even our own children, because that's what I think about
Yeah.
every time is, hey, how can I make my child a better student when she goes into the classroom?
It
So
did. I just now was able to get out of my PowerPoint and go back and look at these. It did make me really think with my kids. Some of which I already get told, and I'm sure you all do, that how much they dislike being my child because of what I do as a career. And therefore I don't let them do anything. And I am not nice like the other parents. And I'm like, well, I'm just trying to keep you from rotting your brain.
right.
But it is, the overall thing I will say is the research is really new. It's all new, and I think we just have to pay attention to what comes out as far as how much we can reverse and how much, and one of the things a lot of it mentioned is that there is so limited research on which things are helping and which things are not. Like, researching the actual tools, because I don't know what all tools you all actually use, but researching the individual tools to see how they're affecting kids, because we know some of them are good. We know some of it is helpful and positive and making a difference. But reducing the time you don't have to be on the screen is what I take away is the biggest.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good takeaway for us. I think in the study that you shared with the preschool students about just the illustrated book and that having that that study where they were the best connectivity after 6 weeks was having someone actually reading with them, and that shows the power of we know about having a child sit in your lap and read with them, but that as a preschool teacher and even on up, I think about all of us, that impact of us connecting with our students, and we talk about that all the time. So thank you so much, Courtney.
You're
This was
welcome.
fantastic. If you all have any other questions, if not, we're going to let Courtney go because I know we have kept
Yeah.
her a little bit past her time. But if
Oh,
you all
you're
have other
fine.
questions,
If
you
you
all
need
feel free to
my-
put those in your evaluation and we can send those to her. I
Yes,
know.
I was gonna say, you can give my email out. I don't care at all.
Okay. Yeah. So I
Thank
know
maybe
she
Hannah
is
sent it.
wonderful to, she'll answer any of our questions. That's another reason why we really wanted to connect, because they're amazing. Like I said, my children have been at Rock Peds. I've got a son that's going to be 21. And so, they've been our wonderful providers. So love them dearly. And, thank you so much. This has just
You're
been
welcome.
amazing.
And if you all do have questions, if you reach out to Wendy, I think she has my email. I don't care if she gives it out at all. So
Awesome. Well, thank you
Bye,
again.
everyone. Love you
Yeah.
guys.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Have a great evening. Courtney, thank you so much.
you're welcome.
Awesome. Thanks.
Bye, guys.